Good afternoon. My name is Wayne Beaton. I'm with the Eclipse Foundation. My role there is Director of Open Source Projects. What that role is my job is to make open source projects at Eclipse successful and committers successful by extension. Before I go any further or get too far in, who here is already an Eclipse committer? Well, that's interesting. Okay. Who hopes to become an Eclipse committer? All right. What projects, just out of curiosity?
I didn't choose one.
Oh, okay. Just interested in general.
You know, I'm near my retirement time, so I'm used to it.
Oh, that's awesome. Cool. How about yourself? Any?
So I'm from Applied Technologies. We are trying to put more effort into the Eclipse open source, and I'm the first peer persons that go into this organization to seek part of the opportunities.
All right, cool. Excellent. I had thought I'd go through everybody, but that's going to take a long time, and I'm already crammed for time here for the slide. So afterwards, actually, I would love to talk to every one of you. The Eclipse Foundation staff, we all have different colored lanyards. I decided to have two to make it really distinct. If we're sitting in a public area, even if it looks like we're working, please feel free to interrupt us. If we're sitting in a public area, the intent is to be interrupted. Again, we're here to help and help make you successful as Eclipse committers, as Eclipse users, as Eclipse community members. The fundamental document, I guess, with the Eclipse for Eclipse projects and Eclipse committers is the Eclipse development process. It defines, among other things, the open source rules of engagement, and I consider that kind of the really critical piece. Much of the document is concerned with a lot of mechanical things, reviews, how projects are structured, that sort of thing. But the fundamentals really are, like, these rules of engagement define much of how we do things at the Eclipse Foundation. The last point is interesting as well. The day-to-day development rules, the development process that an individual project follows is not governed by this document. Projects decide for themselves how they're going to work. Some of them engage in sprints. Some of them really much more ad hoc. Some projects do an annual release with a very well thought out plan at the beginning of their cycle. Some projects do much tighter release cycles. Again, that's really left to the individual project team. You know, when it comes down to like extreme programming versus another agile method or Scrum or whatever, again, the individual projects make that decision. The open source rules of engagement. Very often you hear of these being just stated as open and transparent. I actually tend to think of them in the reverse order. Transparency is relatively easy to think about. As an Eclipse committer, we require that you be transparent to the community, and this takes the form of doing things like capturing the minutes of meetings that you have. Say a lot of our committers work with each other in different organizations, and there's a lot of privileged conversation that happens in an organization, just over dinner or over lunch or whatever it is. When decisions are made during those conversations, to be transparent, you need to make sure that everybody else knows about any decisions that were made. So capturing those minutes in a mailing list that's publicly accessible, or a bug record in the Bugzilla tracking system, or something along those lines. That's our definition of transparency. Issue reports themselves are also another form of transparency. If you're working on a new feature, going away for a week and then dumping a new feature into the project is not particularly transparent. But starting off by describing the feature that you would like to create or you intend to create in an issue report in our Bugzilla system, and then inviting feedback on the feature that you intend to implement, and then as you're implementing it, capturing design decisions that you're making, perhaps even capturing design decisions that you tried to make that turned out to be incorrect and backtracking them. Why you decided that certain decisions were inappropriate. So that kind of thing is basically transparency, telling people what you're doing and what you did. Openness is a little bit different. In some open source circles, these kind of mean the same thing. Not at Eclipse. Openness is really more of being open to the input of others. So if somebody shows up at your project and they have some energy and they want to contribute something, they need to have an equal chance of participating in the project. What we look for, we actually talk about a level playing field. So the idea is that everybody plays by the same rules regardless of who they work for or other factors. Certainly diversity is a goal that we look for in all projects, diversity in all of its forms, different organizations working together, and then of course other definitions of diversity. But again, level playing field, not to say that everybody gets to play, but if you come to play, you get to play by the same set of rules. So there's no extra barriers for people who work for a different organization. So that openness takes the form of even open to changing a project plan based on new input. Somebody shows up with a couple of developers and some time and some energy, and they want to work on some features that are not in your plan. Is that okay? And the answer is not always yes, but the answer at least could possibly be yes, again, assuming that everybody, they want to play by the same rules that you do. And rules can be fairly fine-grained. Some projects have very specific coding guidelines. How do you name variables? If that's how you want to set up your project, I guess that's cool. I do tend to prefer that projects keep the barriers at a reasonable level. Making unrealistically high barriers to entry it prevents this level of openness. So again, requiring that variables have a very specific name, or that I always find the whole argument, and I know by saying it, I'm actually going to start the argument in here. The whole spaces versus tabs argument just drives me crazy. Who cares, right? But some project teams care. Oh, I can't accept your patch because you use tabs. Anyway, if you want to do that, cool, but realize that that's raising the barrier for entry to your project. The final one that I have in terms of our kind of fundamental rules at Eclipse is meritocracy. People earn their way in. If somebody shows up to your project and says, I want to be a committer, the response is, show us what you can do. So if somebody starts contributing patches, and the patches are good patches, maybe the first patch requires a little bit of effort from one of the committers. Maybe needs to be massaged a little bit, or there's a little back and forth between you and the contributor. That's cool. Then another contribution comes in. It turns out they understand the rules of the project now. And after 2 or 3 of these iterations, you start to realize that this individual understands the code base, understands the way the project works, understands the culture. They really should be part of the team. You invite them to become a committer, right? So by developing that merit, and that definition of merit varies from project to project. For some projects, if you show up with a single contribution, the next question they're going to ask you is, do you want to be a developer? Some projects have a slightly higher threshold. And we actually were talking about this yesterday in the Platform Summit. The JDT project has a fairly high barrier for entry in terms of knowledge. You really need to understand how compilers work to become part of JDT Core. And that seems sort of reasonable to me, I guess. Equinox, which forms the foundation of the component system. To become a committer on Equinox, maybe not quite the same height of a barrier, but it's a pretty high barrier. The eGit project, they tend to be a little less picky, right? They're picky. They don't let just anybody in. But the different projects have different standards by which they will accept somebody. Some projects, even somebody showing up and being a known subject matter expert, sometimes that can do well too. But we actually prefer that they develop merit. Even at the Eclipse Foundation, we've actually hired people to work at the Eclipse Foundation, and part of their job is to actually work on some of the open source projects. They have to earn their way into the projects just like anybody else. Being a member of the Eclipse Foundation staff doesn't give you any special privileges. Vendor neutrality kind of flows out from this. The idea is, again, your employment status doesn't have any impact on your committer status. So you can be a committer working for an organization, leave that organization, you're still a committer as far as we're concerned. Just because if an employer calls me and says, retire them as a committer, it's like, well, I can't do that. That's just not the way that it works. So we're neutral in terms of that, at that level. But projects themselves are, while we believe that it's completely reasonable for a project to advertise that certain member companies contribute to the code, and any contributions you make to the code is going to have your email address in it, which may have a reference to your organization. That's all very cool. we try very hard to make sure that projects don't put forward any kind of notion that they are vendor specific, right? So you are not a Red Hat project or an IBM project. You are an open source project at the Eclipse Foundation. So we look for different things along those lines. We also have some rules about the systems that we use. We provide a lot of infrastructure, and frankly, a lot of the infrastructure we provide is primarily because historically we needed to. And we're really we're reevaluating this now anyway. All of our systems are open source. All of our outward-facing systems are open source. So we avoid preferring any particular vendor. We do not, for example, host a jazz instance or team concert, whatever they're calling it now. We don't, so we don't have Jira, because Jira is a commercial product. Despite the fact that we could get a license for it that would allow us to use it without fee, it's just not open source. And again, by using something that is closed source or proprietary, we are preferring a vendor, which we try to avoid. I did say we're actually kind of trying to expand this a little bit, and maybe it's a little bit out of scope to talk about, but basically there are a lot of different external services that can be used. We allow projects to use GitHub, for example, and one of the reasons why we allow GitHub is basically anybody can show up at a GitHub project and they have equal access, just like anybody else. GitHub doesn't impose any barriers. If you wanted to use a service that required that you pay a fee to join, that would be not possible. We would not allow that as part of an open source project's tool set. We're exploring the notion or the ability for projects to use systems that are not under direct control of the Eclipse Foundation. GitHub Issues is permitted, but most of our projects use the Bugzilla instance that we manage. We do have a couple of projects evaluating something called Tulip, but it's an instance of Tulip running on our infrastructure for the time being. We are thinking that maybe it would be okay to use a hosted instance of Tulip somewhere else. But anyway, I think I'm kind of going down a bit of a rat hole, so I'm going to move on. If there's questions about that, please feel free to approach me after. Freedom of action is something that guides a lot of our direction as well. This is one of the things that allowed us to use GitHub. The idea with GitHub is if GitHub decides to change their business model or goes out of business or otherwise becomes inaccessible to us, we do have the ability to take what we have on GitHub and rehost it almost instantaneously. We actually maintain clones of all the repositories that projects run on GitHub, and our webmaster could stand them up on our infrastructure in a matter of minutes if, again, something bad happened. Project teams usually have three communities that they address: users, adopters, and developers. Users, I think, is pretty obvious. End users who use your software. They're not going to touch a compiler. Chances are you're not going to get too many bug reports from users or too much. Our user community for the Eclipse IDE we estimate to be about between 5 and 6 million, depends on which analyst you talk to. The number of users in that community that actually report bugs is relatively small. Actually, interesting question for me. Who here actually has an Eclipse Foundation account? Who here has ever created a bug report? So the rest of you have never encountered a bug in Eclipse. That's awesome. Anyway, so users are users. Adopters are that subset of the community, not technically a subset of the user community, but a community of generally organizations that will take your open source software and incorporate it into their products and services. So, Eclipse Collections is used in a lot of products. Eclipse Link is used as a JPA implementation in a lot of products. The Eclipse platform itself is literally used in thousands of products from various companies. We keep finding new ones, in fact. RCP, the Rich Client Platform in Eclipse, that's massively used. Vertex is huge, Jetty. Anyway, I should stop because I'm going to just keep naming projects. But companies basically take your project code and they will use it in their products. And making them be successful is important because that's actually your primary source of feedback into the project. from the adopter community. And then from the adopter community, some subset of them are the people who will become your contributors and your committers in your project. So these are the people that help you be successful. It turns out help you scale your project. You know, a project that's done by a single organization is interesting, but a project that has the diversity that comes from working with multiple organizations with slightly different goals tends to result in better code and a better, more functional and more long-lived open source and viable open source project. So according to all of these types of users, now, not all projects actually have, these communities, not all projects have a user community. Eclipse Collections, for example, doesn't really have much of a users community. It's adopters, people tend to adopt it. Anyone actually heard of Eclipse Collections? Eclipse Collections is really cool. It's sort of my, have you ever heard, anyone heard of Smalltalk? So anyway, so Eclipse Collections is loosely based on the Smalltalk collection hierarchy. So for us old Smalltalkers, it's awesome. But it's actually, they perform way better. It was created by Goldman Sachs because they had really very tight constraints in terms of the amount of time it takes to do things. So a lot of the reason why the collections framework was created was to be super fast and super efficient. So if you're really, if you got really serious collection requirements, and certainly performance and footprint are important, take a look at Eclipse Collections. So anyway, writing code is fun. This is what we love to do. But to be an open source, a successful open source project, you really need to do more than that. I'm actually writing a proposal for another talk, and I always try not to be negative, but if you just like to write code and you want to just sort of sit and write code and you don't really care what anybody else does with it, just go to GitHub and make a repository and write code and have fun. If you want other people to actually find value in your code and use it, you need to do a little bit more than that. And bringing your project to the Eclipse Foundation is a good starting point. The Eclipse Foundation acts as a steward for the project. We would take possession of the project's name, would provide resources to the project, basically provide a home for the project that is independent of any particular individual or vendor. And that, again, that's all about viability, long-term viability of the project. But to be a successful open source project, you really kind of have to actually be out there and go to conferences and talk about your project and hang out where the users and adopters and developers all hang out for your subject area and answer questions, or, oh, by the way, Eclipse Virgo does that, right? That kind of discussion. Having project-specific diversity goals is important. Again, as I mentioned earlier, diversity is one of those things where, as a keynote speaker actually mentioned, it's one of those things that just makes things better, right? By having diverse interests, very often that can be very frustrating, right? I know what I want to do, but somebody else knows what they want to do. By coming up with a solution that everybody is happy with, you actually wind up making a stronger, more resilient code base that, again, has that longer-term viability. Actively court contributions, actually going out and talking to people and getting them to provide contributions to your project is an important part of being a successful open source project. And of course, when people actually do show up, and sometimes people just show up, like we do actually some advertising for you, and people will find out about your project. I just advertised Eclipse Collections pretty heavily, for example. And I'm hoping that at least one or two of you will go look. When you show up to that project and you ask questions, I expect that project team to engage with you. If you show up with a contribution, say, hey, here's a patch, I expect them to kill with kindness. I expect them to overload you with helpfulness, right? And how do I help you be a successful contributor to the project? Now, different projects at different levels of maturity have different levels of success with that. But ultimately, if you want to be successful, you need to have contributions that come from outside of your immediate project team. And the way to do that is, again, if people do find you, even if by accident, help them be as successful as possible. One of the things that I'm really working on lately, and this is it's strange actually that we haven't, this is something that's, the trademark guidelines have actually existed for a long time, and we've talked to people who've misused the guidelines and their trademarks and have helped them fix them. But something we haven't really leaned on projects enough about lately, or until recently, is to actually include Eclipse in their use of their name. So the Jubula project does a testing framework, GUI testing framework, which is wonderful, and it provides a great deal of value to the Eclipse community. By including Eclipse and Juno, making this tight association between Eclipse and Jubula, we build up the Eclipse brand, which helps build up the Jubula brand. So we believe that this is a circular relationship, and we are working with project teams to make sure that they are reinforcing this use of the Eclipse brand name in their project name, with their project name, along with their projects. So we're getting projects, for example, on their web pages to include Eclipse as part of the project name in the first occurrence. And this is not something that's particularly weird. If you go look at any random Apache project, you'll see it's very consistently Apache Hadoop, for example. So this is something that we haven't done too much lately, but we're really leaning on projects now, and we believe that this is going to be an overall net value to everybody. Certainly, again, building up the Eclipse brand by leveraging the value out of the projects themselves lets the projects, provides value back to the projects. If somebody shows up to your project and they want to participate, one of the best things you can do to them is provide them a contribution guide. And the most obvious place to put the contribution guide is in with the code itself. So we want Eclipse projects to all include a contributing file in the root of every software repository they have, every Git repository they have. The contributing guide will say, how do you make contributions? Does this project work on GitHub? Are we taking requests for Git and we Git patch? I can't remember the term now. Anyway, Git patches, or through Garrett, for example. Has anyone actually used Garrett or heard of Garrett? Garrett's awesome. Anyway, so where do we accept patches, or how do we accept contributions? Where do issues get tracked? You know, having URLs in here with easy links. Help wanted or bug day issues. This is sort of an Eclipse-y thing, I guess, cultural thing. In our Bugzilla system, we have keywords help wanted and bug day. Help wanted basically is exactly what it sounds like. We want help implementing this issue. Bug day, it's an unfortunate name, but bug day basically means we think this one's easy. We just don't have time to do it. So marking your issues or making some source of a list of issues that are relatively easy to fix, relatively easy to have success with, is a great way to attract contributors. And in particular, we actually we participate in student-oriented programs like Google Summer of Code, and there was a Facebook, did a University Academy program, for example. Students thrive on this kind of stuff. I was working with a university in Toulouse that just one day they wanted to, have their students fix bugs. So we, it's relatively easy. We just identify a bunch of these bugs. I kind of prune through them because sometimes commuters think things are easier than they are. But I'll, use this as a basis to seed that discussion. Having a project plan that's well documented, a pointer in your contribution guide that says, what's the plan? What am I doing this quarter? What am I doing for this next release? That sort of thing. The themes, project plans having a theme is a great way for people to know how they can actually work, what contributions can they make that are meaningful to the project team? Are you working on UI issues? Are you working on usability? I think those are the same thing. Are you doing just bug fixes, right? What is the plan for this release? Having that information is really handy. How to build. Your code should be buildable. It's painful how long it took for the Eclipse platform to be buildable by mere humans. But we finally got the Eclipse project to this point, mostly. But most projects should have, if you have a Maven-based build, we have something called the CBI, the Common Build Infrastructure, that's available to projects, which is Maven and Tycho for OSGI-based applications. Hudson, we're actually, Webmaster is in the process of rolling out Jenkins as an option for build orchestration. So having that kind of stuff handy, how to engage, what is the best way to engage with the development team through a dev list or through community forums, the issue tracker. And then if Of course, I'm not sure why spend time with the community is on this slide. Anyway, apparently I have to fix this for the next time I run. People who come to your project to contribute, and this will be, for most of you, this is actually going to be your first stage to joining a project. When you make a contribution to the project, we need to make sure that you actually can do that. And part of that is we get contributors who show up to an Eclipse project to sign the Eclipse Contributor Agreement. The Eclipse Contributor Agreement is based on the Developer Certificate of Origin that comes from the Linux Foundation. Effectively what it says, this is kind of my interpretation of the DCO. Basically, when you contribute to the project, we want to make sure that you believe that you actually can do that. Very often, an employment contract may have you and your employer need to confirm that you are allowed to be working on the open source project. This is not something that a lot of developers don't think about, but we do. We think this is important, and actually a lot of open source organizations use the exact same form of agreement that we're using. Do you have the necessary rights? Are you contributing your contributions under the license of the project? And a notice and an acknowledgement that you know that your contributions are public and that your association with those contributions is public. Something that a lot of people don't understand about contributions is when you contribute to an open source project, you may still own that contribution, and that's certainly true at the Eclipse Foundation. If you contribute code to an Eclipse project, you own that code, or more likely your employer does. That's really between you and your employer. When you put a copyright notice in a contribution that you make, it may be copyright your employer. If you're not employed, it may be copyright you. So some open source projects require that you actually sign rights of your code over to an organization. We don't do that. You basically give us a license to use your contribution with the project. That's why the provided under the licenses associated with the particular project is important. It's worth noting that the Eclipse project itself is not a legal entity, so it cannot actually hold a copyright. So you'll never see copyright Eclipse collections. You'll see the copyright being, in that particular case, Goldman Sachs and others very often. So anyway, just keep that in mind, right? You own your contribution, which basically means if you're contributing under the Eclipse public license, we can't go and change that license to GPL on you, which we would never do. Incidentally, there is a term in the Eclipse public license which says that the project team can switch to a later version, a newer version of the license without consulting you. Yes? So individuals sign the ECA. So it would be you personally would have to sign it, but you would need to get permission from your employer to do that. To become a committer on the Eclipse project, this allows you to do contributions. We have slightly more complicated paperwork requirements for somebody becoming a committer. When you become a committer, we actually need your employer to sign some paperwork. And that's relatively, there's some options there which we can talk about, but again, they're a little out of scope, I think, for now. If there's already committers in your company, and your company is a member company of the Eclipse Foundation, then it's really easy, paperwork-wise, to become a contributor. A committer. You would just have to prove to the team that you're worthy of them. Contributions that come to us through Git need to have appropriate or the correct information in the author field. I've highlighted the author field in mostly bold up there. If you are the author of a contribution, then your name and your email address need to go there. You need to have signed the Eclipse Contributor Agreement using that email address that you've provided there. If your contribution actually has multiple authors, maybe others have helped you. If you put also by statements in the footer section of the comment, we will find those and we will make sure that they get proper credit for having participated in that contribution. If you're using Garrett, this is from Garrett, if you're using Garrett to get that. This is optional. Some projects have different requirements, but I like as a minimum to have a reference to a bug report that I'm addressing. If you put in the square braces, the number of a bug will automatically make a reference from that to the bug when we render this in the display. Finally, if you are a contributor, we require that you have a signed off by clause in the footer. And signed off by basically is reconfirming that you agree to the terms of the ECA, the DCO that's in the ECA. I just lost what DCO stands for. Anyway, so we need you to have an ECA. We need you to use the same email address that you used when you signed the ECA, and we need you to have signed off by in the footer to be a contributor to the project. Once you're a committer, the signed off by is no longer required. Committers, the paperwork covers all of the legal requirements for this. Again, this isn't particularly weird. We're probably a little bit more rigorous about it than a lot of other open source projects. But open source projects that really do care about adoption all do something like this. Linux certainly does. The Apache projects certainly do. We have a fairly thorough intellectual property management process. We actually have a dedicated team of intellectual property analysts who will review the initial contribution to the project. The initial contribution is the initial code base for a new project. So they will review that, and they will also review third-party libraries that are used by the project. Now, their review is pretty thorough. They look for license compatibility. They look for provenance. So third-party libraries in particular, depending on where we find that third-party library, we get them, they actually look through the code to confirm that the code is all actually new code and hasn't been copied from somewhere. That's a pretty painful process, but they actually compare the code that you contribute against a known database of all known open source code, and actually some closed source. So they're looking for copied code that may be under licenses that are not compatible. They check to make sure that the people who say they wrote the code actually wrote the code, and this is actually where the contributor agreement kind of comes in, right? So they'll look like an Apache project tends to manage contributor agreements pretty tightly, so that's handy. It makes it easy for us to bring in Apache code. Anyway, so this IP team takes care of all of this intellectual property management stuff for you, and then once they provide their approval, you can start using the code in your project. The way we engage with them is through something we call IPzilla, which is a modified version of Bugzilla. I'm throwing this out because these are terms that we throw around quite a lot. The CQ, or the contribution questionnaire, is the main form of communication, or main means of communication between the developer community and the IP team. And of course, if you have questions of an intellectual property nature, email to emoipteam@eclipse.org. I'm going to power through because I'm running out of time. We require that projects engage in a formal release process. Anything that a project team decides is for general dissemination, make available to a general community, they're required to go through a release review. The release review is a time where we do a checkpoint to make sure the intellectual property rules are fine and that everything is as clean as we can make it from an intellectual property point of view. But it's also an opportunity for the project team to check with their own management team, which is what we call a project management committee, to make sure that all the right kinds of things have been done. It also serves as a retrospective for the project team to say these are the kinds of things we've done and capture that information in a way that they can share and then share with the community. So anything that's a major or minor release, we require this release review and IP log check. You should plan to spend some time planning and documenting releases, generally at the beginning of a release cycle. Document a plan. At the end of the release cycle, document what happened. At very least, I look in a release document, I look for a description of what was done. What's the big deal about this release? Bug fixes and service releases, we don't require any review or any formality. We just push those out to make them available. We have a lot of IT services. If you're having trouble with our IT services, perhaps you're having trouble with your account, or Bugzilla is not functioning for you, or some challenge with permissions on Git, send an email to webmaster@eclipse.org and they'll get you started. Or you can open up a bug against, in our Bugzilla instance, there's a community product with a handful of different components that for Git and for Bugzilla and for website and that kind of stuff. So if you find problems in there, bugs are also a great way to engage the webmaster team. We do also have the Eclipse Project Handbook, which is your all-in-one guide, everything you need to know to be a committer, or certainly has reference and links to things that aren't in the guide. If you go to eclipse.org/project/handbook, it's there. I apologize, I tried to make it concise. It's a mere 51 pages long. I tend to think of it as a reference manual. I suggest that you do so as well. It has a nice handy section starting a new project at the beginning, which I think lays an important groundwork, and everything else is just more information. We tried to make a balance between concise and valuable. Last point, I think, and I'm already over, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly. The Incubation mailing list is there when you are a new committer joining the Incubation list. Incubation list is really intended for new projects and new project teams. So it's kind of misnamed in this regard, but if you are a new committer and you're not really sure how things are done and you want to ask questions or maybe benefit from the questions asked by others, joining this mailing list, and the URL is there, is a great way to do that. It's a fairly active mailing list, but an order of a few questions a week. It's not overwhelming, but if you're curious about, they ask questions about, hey, how do I set up my build? How do I, when do I need to do a release review? Those kinds of questions. And again, by signing up here, you can benefit from the questions and answers of others. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. We didn't talk about a whole bunch of stuff, but that's kind of the primer. If you do have any other questions, please feel free to ask me. I do a 3-hour version of this, which is painful. But anyway, so we certainly have resources to help you. We have people on staff are there to help you if you run into roadblocks or have problems, so please feel free to use those. I think the most important one is not here. Where is it? Well, rats. If you send an email to emo@eclipse.org, Eclipse Management Organization, emo@eclipse.org. If you're stuck and you have no idea what else to do, send an email there and we will point you in the right direction. Anyway, with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention. I will apologize for, I believe I'm 2 minutes over. I will apologize for that. Again, if you see me sitting in the lobby and you have a question, doesn't matter if I look like I'm heads down, please come and interrupt me. I'm here to be interrupted all week. And I thank you for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm sorry?